Everybody, my wife straight now on what's going to happen next week? Yeah.
It's like they don't know where the food's coming from. They don't know what's coming out of it. What are you cooking?
Yeah. We're cooking chili and a dessert cook-off. And we have after church in fellowship hall, and we'll have somebody that'll judge it, and it'll be just a good time of fellowship, and eating some good food, and seeing if anybody can beat me in the desserts. You know, I've won it 3 years straight, which irritates a lot of people, and I just think it's funny. You know, myself.
It's really funny. Last year, messed up, especially a layer cake, and messed the layer all up. Just gonna throw it out. So just crumple it up. So we crumple the layers up and just put some icing on it.
And I won. You know. Yeah. I had fully. If she had not said that, it was going in the woods. You know.
But I made a cheesecake one time, and it was a complete disaster. I got it out of the oven, I had to put it in a bowl. My kids, this has been like 10 years ago. My daughter, who was 23, still talks about that. Says it's the best. Says, can't you make it like that again? That was a mishap. It's not supposed to be like that.
Yeah.
But also, you don't have to, like, if you're not going to make one to contribute and have all the extras, don't feel like you do, because we have food, we have to, plenty of food. We have
Oh, yeah,
to, like,
plenty of
send
food.
it out to places. We
Yeah,
have so much
yeah.
stuff.
So if you decide not to try to cook anything for the cook-off, that's fine and well. Just please come on and enjoy the food.
Bring your family.
Yeah, bring your family. It'll be good. It's always good. We have 6 or 7 pots of chili at least, and at least that many desserts. So it's, be plenty for everybody. All right, for those of you that are watching by video, you just learned some of what goes on in the class when we're not teaching. Important stuff is going on in the class, that's what I'm saying. All right, so last week we wrapped up with this verse, this slide rather, on Peter's admonition to submit to government. And I just wondered if there were any other follow-up questions or statements regarding that passage from verse 13 through verse 17. We looked at basically, live free as men, as servants of God, which is also a boundary line, that if you're faced with an or else, you fear God. You honor the king, you love the brotherhood, but you fear God. You reverence him. So if there's a line that's drawn, then this is where we go with that. We fear God. We respect him and relate in relations to governmental issues, living in a society controlled by government, which they did certainly in that day. But now beginning in verses 18 through 25, we move into another area of an unjust situation. Peter is addressing this, and he says, slaves, submit yourselves to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if a man bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because he is conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. There is so much in those few verses. But one of the big things that always stands out is the idea of slavery. And the word there in the Greek could also be translated servants. Your translation may have servants versus slaves. So it's a word that was used. Servants would be probably more like house servants. But in either case, they basically are the same usage of that term. Slave or servant, either one could be the translation, but the context of it is clear that these were people that were answering to somebody who owned them. And so before we get into that and look at the dynamics of slavery and what Peter is saying to them, let's look at a couple of things. Now, Peter's words in this section address a condition that was normal. And that's important to remember. It was normal to the lives of everyone in the Roman Empire, including Christians. Peter addresses the current social climate that had in some ways could not be just altered or changed by whim, force, or rebellion. So that's one thing that's important. You know, we get attacked a lot as Christians because they say the Bible believes in slavery, promotes slavery. It does not. But it recognizes the situation of society. And it tells us as Christians, okay, how do you live for me and witness for me within that unjust situation? And this is an unjust social setting, and certainly. So believers already, if you remember what we've already looked at, believers were first strangers, chapter 1, verse 1. Then he talks about them being considered aliens. Not only strangers as if foreign to a country, but aliens to people that they grew up with, that they were living around. And so now they could have also been slaves or servants. So you have at least two strikes against a believer as to, okay, this is my situation in following Jesus Christ. How am I supposed to live for him when this is the world I live in? And it's interesting that he's looking at this. The Bible does not promote slavery. It does not ignore slavery. But it does address living under that condition that you just can't change by snapping your finger or whatever else. In the Roman Empire, remember we touched on this, the Roman government wasn't voted in. It was an emperor who demanded worship and was backed by the greatest military force that region of the world had ever seen before. So it wasn't just something that could be changed. You could ask Spartacus about this, who led the most successful rebellion of slaves and ended up with thousands of them being hung on a cross on the way into Jerusalem. They were crucified. You could not just change this. So Peter's not saying, don't get involved with this. He's just saying, this is how you live when you're in the middle of it. That's one of the things we have to remember. And Peter doesn't address the rightness or wrongness of slavery. Now, in our minds today, we think, oh, well, he should have said a whole lot about it and against it. But remember, the Lord's kingdom was not a kingdom meant to be established on earth. Not an earthly kingdom. It's a spiritual kingdom that has to endure. It has to be lived in multiple situations. And whether a country or nation has a right or wrong type of government or right or wrong type of society, Peter accepts that some believers are in an unjust social setting that is not easily or impossible to change. He doesn't address the rightness or wrongness because it's irrelevant to the lives of these people. He's saying, okay, what I'm going to talk to you about is how you live in the midst of that. Questions? Comments? The church was never set up to be the ideal society. Jesus never meant for us to build the ideal society. You agree with that? Or disagree with it?
I don't know if I agree or disagree, but I will tell you, I saw an example of that at the guy that was
Yeah.
They cannot change their government or their society, but they're Christians and they just have to act. But there can definitely be a penalty, a very
Yeah.
real penalty,
Yeah.
when they act.
Nigeria, they just had another 200 and some people kidnapped by Boko Haram, that radical Muslim group. Probably most of them Christians, because in Nigeria, Christians are being slaughtered. They go into cities, go into towns, hunting Christians. You either convert to the Muslim religion or off your head goes. So another situation to where they can't change that. How do you live in that? And we can talk about whether something's right or wrong in a society. We can talk about a whole lot in our own society that is either right or wrong. But it really comes down to be irrelevant to the individual's relationship to God. The church was never set up to be the ideal society or to build. Maybe that's the way I should have set it up. It was never set up to set up the ideal society. Roman Catholicism believes that the church ought to rule the world, and the Pope being the vicar between man and God, between man and Jesus and Mary and so forth. Jesus never meant that. He meant for bodies of believers to be together. Should we influence government and society? Certainly. But we may be in a situation where our influence is limited. We can't change that larger macro, so we work on the micro, individual. Now, do we have situations that are unjust today? Social status, education, economic position, your family name. You ever heard anybody say you ought not be around that group of people because of what their last name is? You know how that family is. They've always been trouble. I remember somebody saying that. That's like, well, you know they are so-and-so. That family's they've always, so you don't have anything to do with them. Why? For no other reason than because of their name and the history associated with their name. Background, physical condition, a certain skin color, any situation of unfairness that one can't just change. I remember growing up, and social status and economic position played a lot. We were poor, and there was folks that, as I grew older, I was good friends with in elementary school. But as we got older, got into middle school, the economic and social status began to take effect. I couldn't keep up financially with what they could do. I couldn't dress like they did. Other such things as that. And that economic position began to, and especially in the 60s, you had to look a certain way to be accepted. If you didn't look a certain way, then you were liable to be teased, left out, maybe even physically attacked for it. Any situation of unfairness that one just can't change. Peter's message for us is talking about how we witness for the Lord in that type of situation. That's why he's talking to slaves here. Questions, comments? You ever been in an unjust situation? Other than maybe this class, you know. I'm just seeing if you're awake out there. That's all I'm saying.
And what we do if we came across an unjust situation? I come back to, sometimes I watch that, What Would You Do on TV, and
Never seen it.
it's where they have actors that go in and there's situations that, they're trying to see how the public would react to those
Okay.
situations. When you see situations, just like, okay, somebody that is hungry, and they don't look like
You can. It depends on the leading of the Holy Spirit. And I think that as Christians, we have opportunities that the Lord lays before us to do things for other people. That it may be obvious to us that they need, and the Spirit says, okay, you're the one I have brought here today to help this individual. Or it could be someone that looks totally different, looks like, they ain't got a problem, but the Lord might say, you need to do something because I know this person needs so-and-so. Remember Matt talking about in a sermon here some time ago that he just was impressed by the Lord to buy a pair of boots for this guy. They were at the same store, and he was going to buy a pair, Matt buying a pair, and he said, he fought it for a little bit. I don't, he can buy them. But the Lord kept hammering on him until he bought it, and the guy was buying a rather expensive pair of boots, and Matt was feeling a little bad after that because he spent a couple of $100 paying for this guy's pair of boots, but the guy just broke down and cried. It wasn't obvious. But the Lord knew that this man needed something done for him. Not because he was financially unable, but because of the emotional situation that he was in. And sometimes, when we have a situation like that, the Lord may impress upon us, you're the one, you need to do something. Or not. Doesn't mean we got to feed everybody that's hungry.
Even in the workplace, I experienced the good old boys club where I think you do that, they will we're not considered as capable.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to get into what the Greco-Roman idea of women were.
Well, the bad thing about that is that we want to sit here and think that doesn't happen today.
Oh, yeah.
That is very hard because very much so, you still have women in the workplace that experience that every day. You have women in churches that experience that. You have women, but not just churches. You have women everywhere. But there's a couple things up there that still happen. A certain skin color, very much
Certainly, yeah.
happens. Like I say to my boys constantly about somebody, and it's hard because you have to know when to say something and when not. And I'll be honest with you, where we live, most of the time you don't say anything. But I get in the car and I'll say, yeah, show me you're racist without showing me you're racist. Because a good, who I even really think they're a good person, they just don't realize what they said. I truly think they don't realize what they said. And you're just like, are you kidding me? Did you just say that? But you can't say that. So you have to smile and bless your heart and all.
Yeah, bless your heart, yeah.
Bless your heart. But
In corporate government, corporate companies today, I see more people of color and more women pushed into positions than men. It's like there's open and you have more of a lack of knowledge with people that are bosses.
Yeah, the diversity pushed especially in big cities, universities, things like this.
You have more women and more
They're,
people of color
in order to satisfy the,
or totally clueless to what's going
Yeah.
on. And I'm like,
yeah.
I just don't, what y'all were saying, I see just the opposite.
Oh, yeah. Now, when I put up here a certain skin color, that could be us. It's becoming more us. Because you're reading more and more articles where white people do not apply. Actually, it has been said.
When you do two wrongs, it doesn't make it right.
No, doesn't make it right.
Because that's like the DEI stuff, and I do understand this. That stuff, some of it's insane that they're working with. But still, two wrongs don't make it right.
No. And that's the reason that I say, and this is the reason why Peter doesn't address the rightness and wrongness of it. Because you see it all over the place. Now, how do we live in the middle of all that as a believer? How do we exist? How do we stand up, or how do we live a testimony of Jesus Christ in the middle of all of that. So when we think about witnessing in unjust situations, let's look at a little bit about slavery in the Roman world. Slaves. And I'll read you a little bit of this, because I don't think I don't have it all typed out. Now, slaves in the Roman world. Roman slaves had freedom of movement, status, could work, and buy their freedom. That's a general statement that's true. Some people sold themselves into slavery in the Roman Empire to rich families because it increased their status. So I'm a slave of Julius Caesar versus a slave of Billy Poindexter over here. I mean, the social economic ranking change would be dramatic in that world. And slaves still, and I'll read a quote here, slaves in the Greco-Roman world were under the control of their master, and hence they had no independent existence. They could suffer brutal mistreatment at the hands of their owners, and children born in slavery belonged to masters rather than the parents who gave them birth. Slaves had no legal rights. Masters could beat them, brand them, and abuse them physically and sexually. Slaves could purchase their freedom in the Greco-Roman world with the help of their masters, which is a procedure called manumission. Manumission, however, was available mainly for urban slaves, city slaves. And most slaves had no hope of being manumitted. You remember when Paul was arrested, the centurion that came to him. And Paul, when he learned that Paul could speak Greek and so forth, Paul told him, I'm a Roman citizen. And the centurion said, I purchased this. He had been a slave and bought into Roman citizenship. But Paul said, I was born a Roman. Once again, social economic status played into that. Paul was born a Roman citizen. This man had to buy his citizenship. So, citizens or slaves in the Roman world, we talk about American slavery and how terrible it was. Yes, slaves in the Roman world weren't any better off necessarily. They could buy their freedom. They could even own slaves if they got rich enough, being part of a master's house. They could become rich enough to buy their own slaves. So here you have a slave owning slaves. And by the way, you had some blacks in America that owned slaves in the 1800s. So that was slavery in the Roman world. Now, what would be normally expected of a person in that type of situation? What was normally expected of slaves? This is what the normal expectation of a slave was to the Roman owner. Lazy, untrustworthy, dangerous. They could act in ways that could damage their master or master's family. They could seek to run away. This was the expectation of a slave in their life, of what they might do. And they had to really prove that they wouldn't do this. But this was how they were looked at. Peter is saying in witness, they needed to show something radically different. Now, this is what, and you think about us today. If we lived in a situation dominated by somebody, this would be probably our normal thought of expectation of what we're going to do if we get a chance. Peter says to witness for Jesus Christ and to be a witness as a Christian, you need to show something that is radically different. He says submit. And that word submit means live according to the relationship. Live according to what you're in, what you're involved with. In this case, slaves that really couldn't get loose. So you have to live according to the relationship. The expected reaction, fight, resist, drag your feet, rebel, irritate, undercut, all those things. But the radically different response, with all respect. Look at what he says. Slaves, submit yourselves to your masters with all respect. That was the radical difference. Whether they treated you bad or whether they treated you good. Submit to them, live according to the situation with all respect. Now,
Just thinking, that's when he said, hey, carry the thing the extra mile, that you carry a mile, you throw stuff down, I've done my.
yeah, I've done. Now you carry it.
What he's saying there is, instead of just doing that mile, you take the next mile.
Yeah.
And then that guy's looking at you like, what is the deal with you?
Exactly. That's exactly what the Lord wants us to create in the minds of the people that we're around. Why do you folks act like that? Why don't you talk like everybody else in our group? Why don't you go to the shows or go to the bars or go to the whatevers or do whatever like the rest of us do at this job site or whatever it is? Why? That's the whole point of what Peter has given to them in this book. Because you want them to ask you why. And he tells them in chapter 3, verse 15, be ready to give an answer for the reason of your hope. Why do you act like this? Because I have an expectation, not a maybe. That hope is not maybe, it's an expectation. I have an inheritance, I have a new life. They open the door by saying why we walk through it. We've got to be ready to walk through it and give an explanation of that. He said, submit. The radical difference with all respect. And that would be a radical difference. I can't imagine being a slave. I can address being talked down to, ignored. I was in a work situation where I had a supervisor tell me, I didn't want to hire you when I hired you. But your credentials are so good, I thought I ought to give you a chance. And I sat in that person's presence. They went over my evaluation, your merit evaluation in that job. Went over it 5 times in my presence, trying to lower it enough that I would not get my merit raise. Sat right in front of me, and it kept going above. Well, let's look at this 5 times. And then when I was the senior person on the team, when that person was leaving, they told me, said, I know that you're the senior person. You get along with everybody, but I'm not going to recommend you to take my job. There was somebody else who was their little stool pigeon that person was going to recommend. I know what it is to have to play, not second fiddle. Didn't even have a fiddle, you know. And how do you live under that? How do you go through it? With all respect. That's what you give back. That's what you give back. They may ignore it, they may disregard it, but look at what he says. For it is commendable if a man bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because he is conscious of God. There's an issue there for us. When we think about unjust settings, how do we apply this in our day, in our world? Remember Peter's words at the beginning, chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. Abstain from sinful desires. Now, there was a number of times I really wanted to pin that person's ears back. and came very close to being something other than a Christian in that situation. And live good lives. Live in a way that puts to shame what they say about you. That was the two things he started this with. How do we live in that? These are the two general rules for whatever unjust situation, whatever place we are in life. Abstain from sinful desires. Live good lives. And remember, you want them to ask why. Now, that person never did ask me why. They could care less. But my obligation was to God. That's the important thing about it. Why should we act differently in these situations? Because it's commendable. It's commendable before God. We do not act in abstaining from sinful desires and living good lives. We don't do that just to get people off our back or just to ingratiate ourselves. It is commendable before God. And I think that's powerful.
And I do think as you get older and wiser too, hopefully, but you also, in those unjust situations, like you can literally write down on paper why they're wrong. But see, facts don't matter. And also God gives you, or the Holy Spirit discernment is like, why does it matter? Because you shouldn't say anything because you can't change their mind anyway.
No, you can't change
So
it.
I think you need to know that if you learn when to do something and when, you know, in your head, I promise, I'll like, you just can't fix stupid, but you don't say it. But it's just like, I think about it all the time, and I'm like, okay, because why does it matter if there are points where it doesn't? Sometimes you can witness to somebody, but like that person, you could have laid out, you have laid out 16 facts as to why you're the best person. But no matter what you say, you're not going to change their mind. Unjust situations are the hardest thing in life for me. I'm a very right-wing person. But you have people that just don't look at facts, they don't want to, they're mean people, horrible, and or whatever, for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And you just go, what's your problem?
Yeah.
Why? You know?
And we live it, we live an example, that witness, conscious of God. Do we put up with a bad situation, being conscious of God? Sometimes we put up with it, well, yeah, bless their heart, you can't fix stupid. And if I ever catch them on the side street, you know, if I ever get the opportunity. No, we do this conscious of God. Do we act the way we act in our homes, on our jobs, around others, and so forth, conscious of God? I always try to remember in my own life, in situations that may come up, I am standing before Jesus Christ. Because I am. We all are. We're always standing before Jesus Christ. The object is, okay, now, how do I act knowing that he's going to see what I'm going to say or do? Now, that works for me. It may be totally something different for you. But that helps me keep my mind focused on what I need to focus on, which is living conscious of God. Being a Christian witness. And one that...
As Christians, I've just lived through a very unjust situation in my job. And even though I knew it was myself who was being impacted, and even though I knew that what I had to say was not going to make any difference in the situation, I mean, I prayed about it for weeks.
Yeah.
I felt like God was saying to me, because I am in the position I am in the district, that somebody has to bring attention to this. And I feel it's, and I did in a very respectful way.
Yeah.
But I knew that nothing was going to change, but at the same time, I wanted those that were in that position of authority, that were making these decisions, to know
Yeah. Yeah.
that I recognized that this was unjust, it was not equitable, and that others were being impacted by it.
Yeah.
No impact right now, but I don't know what might change down
Right.
the road. I felt like that was what God was telling me to
Yes,
do.
certainly.
I don't feel like God is always telling us to stick
No, no. There's times the Lord will say, plant this seed, which is what you did. And you may never see the fruit of it, but others may. And there are times when you do need to. And in one situation in this job, I think before I met Teresa. And I really wasn't quite as dedicated as I later became. And my supervisor did something that really made me angry. And I went to the secretary of the person that was over that supervisor. They were in a meeting. I told the secretary, get them out of that meeting. And I probably said it just like that. And they went into the meeting, because this person was leading the meeting, and pulled them out and said, Billy needs to talk to you, and you might better need to talk to him. And I laid out what the situation was and said, I'm going to go see this person. I'm just letting you know I'm going to see him. By the time I got to that person's office, they had called that person and said, whatever Billy wants, give him, And I came in loaded. And just took all my wind out of my sails. Because I knew I had another job somewhere else. I was going to be so unchristian in what I was going to say to that person. But there are times that you do speak up. You do let a person know. I know what's going on. I understand this. And it may make a difference. It may not.
And that is, as you go, I do think being aware, because there's so many unjust things happening.
Yeah.
That you do have to know being aware. And also the way I get through it, and I guess everybody gets a way to get through it, is I'm just like, if God can part the seas, and this is awful, like God can take care of this person.
Yes.
Because he will do it, it's real, and it's not something I can change.
Yeah. We have to be conscious of God in this.
But I also let them know when I met him that I had prayed about it. And what I was saying to them was what I felt like my God that I serve wanted me to say to them.
Yeah.
And I walked away feeling completely at peace about what I had to say.
Yeah. You had obeyed the Lord, yes.
I did what was right in that situation.
Yeah.
And see, when you do that, though, you know, and that's what you should do. Because I pray about things, and sometimes, like, I don't even want to say it. And I feel like, well, God's wanting me to do this. And I'm like, okay, I'll do it. And I wish I could even say willingly, but I'm worried about it. But I do think as you go, there are times when you say something, there's times when you say something really loud, but there are also those times when you are so right and they are so wrong. And it's not just you, they are so wrong in general to the whole public, but it's like, no, God's not leading me to take care of that. Just God, or me, God's leading me to keep my shut.
Yeah, and the Lord will tell us sometimes that we'll impress when to not say something. He will impress us to say something. In both situations, we are obeying the Lord. We're just being conscious of God. Lord, what do you want me to do about this? Is there anything I can do? If I can't, how do you want me to handle this? What do I say? How do I act around this person or this group or whatever? That's being conscious of God. And it doesn't mean we'll walk around with a halo on our heads, but it means that we live in a way that other people who are experiencing this might say to us, I don't get you. Why do you live like this? Why didn't you really, cuss them out? Why didn't you throw a fit? Why didn't you this, that, or the other? Then we have the door open to us by the Lord. Yeah, unjust situations. Now, Peter goes on to say, we were called to this. Verse 21, to this you were called. To this what? This type of response to unjust situations. To this you were called, because Christ gave you an example that you should follow in his steps. That is not easy. Dealing with the public is never easy, and all of you know that. I'm not giving you a news flash. But Christ has left us an example that we should follow in his steps. So, what does that mean to you? Following his steps. How do we apply this in situations? And I know they're going to, they've even forgotten to ring the bell. I mean, it's 20 after, and they hadn't rung the bell yet on me. Maybe we'll follow up with this next week, you know what I'm saying? All right, thank you. Great conversation, y'all. Thank you.